Welcome to CPAC Now, America Uncanceled. I'm Mercedes Schlapp. And tonight's show, we've got Missouri Attorney General Eric Schmidt and Texas State Senator Angela Allen Paxton on. But before we go to our fabulous guests, we begin with more outrage over Afghanistan. Let's play the clip of President Biden's speech from yesterday.
The extraordinary success of this mission was due to the incredible skill, bravery, and selfless courage of the United States military and our diplomats and intelligence professionals.
An extraordinary success. Yes, that is right. That is what Joe Biden is calling the evacuation, the swift withdrawal of Afghanistan with no plan, horrible execution, leaving behind our allies, leaving behind Americans, and it's shameful. It's shameful what President Biden has said and what he has done. And the mere fact is that I'm glad that Republicans are standing up and calling Joe Biden to resign. But let me tell you, there's a long list of those Democrats who need to resign, including Kamala Harris, who has failed on the border, as well as the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense. This has been the biggest catastrophic foreign policy disaster that I have seen in my lifetime. I want to bring up Matt Schlapp's tweet saying MSNBC is, first of all, I don't know what he's doing watching MSNBC. Okay, let's just start from there. But I guess, he had some extra time. He says MSNBC is talking about a Biden doctrine. Cutting and running and abandoning Americans is not a doctrine. It's a disgrace. I think that sums it all when it comes to what we're seeing with Joe Biden. It's why you're seeing his poll numbers plummet. It's why you're seeing more Americans basically not trusting what Joe Biden is saying. And he then turns his back on the media and doesn't even answer questions. As Americans, we deserve to learn and know what our commander-in-chief is thinking. Sadly, I don't think there's very much going on in that brain. And one other thing that happened in Congress, this is also another disgraceful action. Speaker Pelosi blocks the names of the 13 U.S. service members from being read on the House floor. I got to tell you, these Democrats, their silence on this issue, their denial of how this whole thing has been executed, how they have treated these families who have lost loved ones is something that we should never forget. And us as Americans have to hold these Democrats and these political leaders accountable. And yes, we need to call for their resignation and the Biden administration because of their constant failure, because of the fact that what you're seeing is a lot of innocent lives are going to be lost because now you've got a terrorist organization running the country. This because Joe Biden really made a huge error in getting out of Afghanistan without holding the Taliban accountable. Now I'd like to bring in one of our wonderful guests. I'm so excited to have her on the show. And it's your first time on CPAC Now. Angela Allen Paxton, Texas State Senator. I know there's a lot of news happening in Texas, but Angela, first of all, thank you for joining us on CPAC Now.
Well, Mercedes, thank you so much for having me. And it's a pretty exciting day. We're at this moment in time where there's so much going on in Texas and in the legislature. So thanks for having me.
Of course, before we get started as to what's happening in Texas, I do want to get your reaction from what we saw yesterday. President Biden giving this speech. It was almost sounded like it was a mission accomplished type of speech, very ceremonial, happening at the White House. What's your reaction to how President Biden is basically in his own mind saying this was a successful evacuation?
Well, it's an example to me of words completely divorced from reality. And this is, I have a personal perspective on this, and I think I've shared this with you before, but I've got a daughter in the Air Force that has served in Afghanistan twice. She was deployed to Afghanistan actually in the last year, and I'm very thankful. She showed up on our doorstep on Christmas Eve, actually, and we didn't expect her home for another few months. So, you know, it's very personal to me because as I'm thinking about these young people who lost their lives, I think about my daughter who just got married. I think about these individuals that won't have those opportunities. I have two sons-in-law that are also in the military. I have former students. Before coming to the Senate, I was a teacher and a school counselor. I was just in the last week in touch with one of my former students who serves in the military and was deployed to Afghanistan. And he was reaching out to me to see if I could get any help for his interpreter who had helped him, who was trapped. And you know, these people are marked for death because they helped America. So I think, you know, it's not just, these aren't just numbers. These are people, and these are families who have lost family members, and they've given their lives for their country. Our country should take care of them.
First of all, thank you for your family in serving our country and defending our freedoms. You know, I think that as we go into this 9/11, 20th anniversary of 9/11, you know, we had made so much progress in Afghanistan. Afghan women and children and young girls were back in school. Afghan women could go to work. And we had really moved the country in a right direction. And we were providing basically support. It wasn't like we were running the country. We were there providing intelligence and air support to the Afghan forces. And I just feel that Joe Biden's been spending a lot of time blaming President Trump, blaming the Afghan forces, and pretty much just, you know, saying, I give up. Do you feel the same way, or where do you think Joe Biden's going with this?
Well, the thing that doesn't make sense to me is, I mean, we have to make decisions about staying somewhere, leaving somewhere, but this is not the first time we've extracted our forces from another country. Actually, interesting personal story. Just recently, I was had someone, you know, a driver from an airport to a conference that I was at, and this young man was Iraqi, and he had been there as a young man serving and helping the United States when Saddam Hussein came into power. And
right.
I had asked him, you know, how did you come to the U.S.? And he told me the story, and he said that his mother actually came to him and said, it is not safe for you to stay here. And I don't want you to leave, but I don't want you to die. And so he actually left, and of course has made a life here in the United States. But we had a process. There is a process for extracting, for leaving. There's an order that you do things in, and it's inexplicable to me why it was not executed in a way that makes sense. You know, the decision to leave or go or stay, it's a complicated situation, I know. But we know how to leave in a responsible way that takes care of the people that took care of us, that takes care of our folks. And just one other note, as you were mentioning, the plight of women and girls is absolutely reprehensible.
I agree. I think, you know, we're going to keep our eye on what's happening there in Afghanistan. I don't think this issue is going away anytime soon, but I do want to turn to what is happening in Texas. Goodness gracious, y'all know how to run a government there. You know, I know there's always talk that Texas is going to leave the United States, but let me tell you, just watching the incredible work that the governor is doing, that the Republicans are doing to hold the Democrats accountable. Let's walk through what happened in this legislative session. What were you all able to accomplish?
Well, as you know, we accomplished a lot during our regular session. We're in session every other year in Texas in odd-numbered years, and we had a lot of great victories in the midst of a lot of challenge. We had the winter storm, but out of that, we learned a lot. And I think, you know, one of the things we have going on in Texas that a lot of states don't have, we've got a very fast-growing population. The district I represent is incredibly fast-growing, just north of Dallas in Collin County. So one of the things that I think it brought to our attention was the need to increase generation, to make sure we're weatherized, and that we continue to have cheap, reliable, dependable energy, and that we're depending on dependable energy, not intermittent energy. We learned a lot from that. We've reformed a lot with ERCOT and the PUC. We passed some great human life protections. I'm an adopted child. This is very close to my heart. My life began under circumstances that very often lead to an abortion. But we were able to pass the Human Life Protection Act. I got to carry that bill. That's a bill, should Roe v. Wade be overturned at the Supreme Court level, it will automatically go into effect in Texas, which will save lives. We won't have to wait until another legislative session to kind of pass something. The heartbeat bill, which people are so familiar with, was passed as well. We passed, and I carried the freedom for churches so that churches cannot be closed during a declaration of a disaster or emergency. So we did a lot of great things to, we helped our retired teachers, a lot of just things that you want government to do. And in fact, today is a great day. September 1st is the day that legislation goes into effect in Texas that was passed during the regular session. But as you know, at the end of the session, you mentioned that Texas knows how to run a government. So I agree with that, but we have some people that just know how to run. And we had a lot of folks of the other party, the Democrats, that left in the House on the eve of the election bill. We've passed it 5 times in the Senate. We finally passed it yesterday, and it has passed the House. That will become law. So that's very important. We also yesterday began the process, and we'll, I think, finish it today, to increase border security funding. We passed $1.1 billion in the regular session. We just added another 2.8 in this.
Let's step back one second. You said that there are some of these politicians that know how to run. I think that they know how to run away from Texas. Obviously, living here in the swamp for quite some time in Washington, D.C., showing off their bras as they were washing them over their showers in the hotel rooms. I mean, you really can't make this up, but let's go back to this election integrity piece. I think it's really important for our audience to understand, because there's always the verbiage from the left, the messaging from the left that, oh, this means voter suppression. You even hear the mainstream media saying, oh, they're taking away rights for those people. Why is this bill so critical, as we know that will create uniform statewide voting hours and other proponents in that bill that actually expands voter access and at the same time safeguards our election process?
This bill is about 2 things: making it easier for qualified voters to vote and harder to cheat. That's all this bill does. And you would think everyone would be behind that. But I heard immediately when this bill was introduced in the regular session, the narrative of the mainstream media was that it was a voter suppression bill. It was a voting rights bill. And I even heard folks that think more like I do talking about it, about a voting rights bill. And I said, stop right there. This is not a voting rights bill. This is an election integrity bill. And it is about making sure our elections are secure and fair. They're about protecting people's right to vote. It is about making sure that the votes are the real votes. And it was interesting to me. I think I said we passed this bill 5 times in the Texas Senate. And it was interesting during the debate on the floor each time, the talking points from the other side. And they focus on things like suppression. They focus on a narrative that there is no evidence that any fraud has happened. And, it is just, again, as we talked earlier, words not matching reality. Testimony after testimony after testimony of individuals who had experienced the dark side of voter harvesting, whose votes were stolen by people supposedly assisting them at the polls who were actually voting for them. But this bill expands voting hours. It makes sure that people with disabilities have protections and safeguards for their vote so it doesn't get stolen, but also to help them cast their ballot in the way they want to have it cast. One of the other arguments from the other side was against poll watchers. And we heard a lot about this real concern about poll watchers. We already have poll watchers. That's not even new. But they acted like it was a brand new thing. It allows, though, for people to observe what's going on. It live streams ballot counting, which is just transparency. It is a common sense bill that makes sense, and it is critical that we pass it before we have another round of elections.
Right, and it looks like Governor Abbott will be signing that piece of legislation. We also saw the Supreme Court in favor of and allows for the Texas 6-week abortion ban to take effect. I think that's actually really solid news. I know you talked about a little bit about the heartbeat bill. What does this mean in terms of the Supreme Court making this announcement and making this decision?
Well, I think it's critical, and you can kind of hear people's just the way they word things, right? It says so much what they call something. Someone that calls this the election bill a voter suppression bill, right? You know where they're coming from just by what they call it, and it's so interesting to me that when we talk about the issue of abortion, I mean, first of all, every abortion ends a human life. This is not debatable. You can argue beyond like if that matters or doesn't matter, but we have to all agree it does end a human life, and we shouldn't do that lightly. Certainly we could all agree there, but you'll notice that is not where the left takes the argument. They take it to abortion access, like it's a foregone conclusion that an abortion is fine. And I think that if you have reasonable people sitting around, even just a few years ago, the Democratic Party talked about abortion in the sense of, it should be rare and safe, right? Do you remember that? It should be rare.
And they took it all out. They didn't want to use the word rare anymore on their platform. And it's just fascinating.
That's completely gone. It's completely gone. And I think, it says a lot about people's view of human dignity. And so many of these things that we're talking about really are at their core about human dignity. A person who has the right to vote, whose vote is stolen, that's taking something that belongs to someone, right? A baby, there was and I can't remember who wrote the article, but I just saw, I believe it was an NFL player, and he said a baby in the womb shouldn't have to prove their worth to be born. I thought it was a beautiful statement. But when you don't value life in the womb, it is no wonder that we deal with all of these kinds of issues in our culture. End of life, children in foster care, all of these things, women who are in the, after an abortion. What about those women?
Yeah, it's very tragic. And I think the one thing that the Republicans have done a very good job at is standing for life, standing for the unborn children, being that voice. I know when I was working at the White House, President Trump was one of those who completely understood. He didn't come from the pro-life movement, but he quickly understood and had the common sense to say, this is executing a baby. This is not what we need to be doing. We need to support life pregnancy centers across the country. We need to let women know that there's an option, that, Planned Parenthood doesn't provide an option for these women. It's very clear that they try to keep it away from them and not inform them of what this means. I think this is an issue, obviously, that we're going to keep fighting against Planned Parenthood, to defund Planned Parenthood, because goodness gracious, they run a big piece of this political process. Angela Allen Paxton, Texas State Senator, thank you so much for joining us on CPAC Now.
Hey, thank you so much, Mercedes. Thanks for what you guys do to have your words match reality. I appreciate that.
Well, we thank you. We thank you for your incredible service. Obviously, we love the Attorney General there, Ken Paxton. who is a rock star and someone who we love at CPAC. We love you both. It's important to have strong conservative leaders that continue to talk about what we need to do to stop the radical left. And that's exactly what you're doing every day.
Well, thank you, and I'll tell him you said hi.
Okay, perfect. And we'll be right back with Attorney General from Missouri, Eric Schmidt. Welcome back to CPAC Now, America Uncanceled. And joining us from the great state of Missouri, Attorney General Eric Schmidt. Eric, it's great to see you.
Great to see you too.
So is this like this is your first time on CPAC Now, right?
It is, yeah. Quite the honor. I'm thrilled. So thanks for having me.
That's great. And the reality is, everyone, that his comms person, Charlie, is one of the best in the business because I trained her, okay? So he's very lucky to have her.
Listen, you're not alone in feeling that way, but the shout out is well deserved.
Yeah, before we get started, I really want to get your opinion on what we're seeing with the fallout in Afghanistan and President Biden's recent actions that have led to stranded Americans, to a terrorist organization taking control of the country, to the Afghan people living in fear.
It's a total disaster, and perhaps the worst foreign policy disaster, certainly in my lifetime and in generations, I think. And we've seen this President Biden betray the American worker, and this is really tantamount to a betrayal of the American soldier. And to the idea that we're leaving Americans behind is unconscionable. And the deadline, as I sent out on social media, ought to be when every single American is home. That's the only deadline that matters. And it's a complete failure of execution. It's a complete failure of planning. He won't take questions about it. I think what you saw, when the servicemen returned, his lack of respect was appalling. I had a chance to speak with one of the soldiers who was actually from Missouri, his father, the day that he got word, and, our hearts are breaking for all of them. Our prayers are with his family and all the service members who died, but there are people left there in Afghanistan. It's an unbelievably terrible situation, and Joe Biden owns this. There's no way around it.
Yeah, I just don't think he can even politically recover. And I do think this impacts Democrats across the board because they're really, I almost feel like they're just kind of silent and supporting him. What do you think?
Yeah, and they want to change the subject here real quickly, don't they? And they have a lot of the mainstream media aiding them in that, and now talking about how Republicans are pouncing and seizing and wielding and all these sorts of things now. But yeah, it's really hard, I think, for any Democrat to defend him. They're remaining very, very quiet, but they definitely want to turn the page. But the American people, you've seen in the polling, recognize this, and it's not just Republicans. Independents and Democrats think this has been a disaster.
Yeah. Do you think anyone's going to resign from the Biden administration?
I don't know. I hope so. But they really refuse to take any responsibility over this. I think they're just hoping that they can keep saying the same things and not answering the tough questions, and whole thing will go away. But I think the American people are going to remember.
You had a big win. We just saw that you, as well as Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton, we actually had his wife is on the show tonight as well. By the way, she is quite the talent. I know we love Ken, but goodness gracious, Angela, she's great. And you all had a great win here. And she actually said hi. She said to say hi to you, Eric. But you all had a great win today in terms of the Supreme Court basically supporting you all in the Remain in Mexico policy. They ruled in favor, a 6-3 vote here. What do you think this means for stopping the influx of illegal immigrants who are flooding our southern border?
Well, it's a big win for border security. It's a big win for the rule of law. Missouri and Texas teamed up for this lawsuit against the Biden administration. On day one, Joe Biden reversed President Trump's very successful Remain in Mexico policy, or the migrant protection protocols, which essentially said that Mexico is going to be the waiting room. While you're waiting for your asylum hearing, which we know, by the way, 9 out of 10 asylum claims are bogus, but while you're waiting, you're going to be in Mexico. Biden reversed that. So what happened? You had all these cartels, which this is big business, by the way, moving illegal immigrants into the country, knowing that as they're waiting for their court date in America, they're released into the interior United States, and you never see them again. And so we've seen at least 1.1 million illegal immigrants come across the border since January that we know of. That is an open border. It's the Democrats' plan here, but thankfully our lawsuit against the Biden administration on this was successful. The Supreme Court, as you mentioned, ruled 6-3. So the Remain in Mexico policy that was working under President Trump has now been reinstated. And again, it's a huge win for the rule of law, border security, and actually making sure we have a functioning immigration system.
Can you explain to our audience why states like Missouri, you're not a border state, so why would you get involved in this case? Why would you say that, what's happening in terms of the chaos in the southern border impacts other states throughout our country?
It's a great question. And really, when we were working with Texas on this, we viewed Missouri as representative of all the other states that aren't border states. There's a couple of things. One is every American has a vested interest in having a secure border and making sure our laws are abided by and that we don't have a steady stream of people coming here illegally. Secondly, Missouri, we have taken very seriously this idea of tackling human trafficking. Missouri is the intersection of a number of different interstates. Just this past Friday, Missouri led a 12-state human trafficking raid where there were over 100 arrests. 40 plus victims were rescued. Human trafficking is a real thing. It's everywhere. And we saw an increase in human trafficking and drug trafficking across the southern border because the same cartels that are moving drugs were trafficking and are trafficking human beings. And there's a price tag associated with women and children they're getting across the border. So we saw this influx. We knew this was going to be an increased problem in Missouri, which was one of our interests that we stated to the court. The court agreed that we had standing to pursue on that. And so, again, it was just a great win. Missouri and Texas really standing up, fighting for the rule of law, pushing back against this Biden administration. It's one of several challenges that we have. And I think the Republican AGs right now are really that kind of last line of defense against the excesses and abuses of the Biden administration. And we're very grateful that we scored a big win for border security.
So what is your message to the border czar, our Vice President Kamala Harris?
Well, she needs to show up, I suppose. I mean, she's completely abdicated her responsibility on this. I mean, they will put her anywhere except on the southern border. And clearly, when President Trump was in office, the mainstream media tried to exploit this, and he actually had a policy that was working, and he deserves a lot of credit for that. The Biden administration is the exact opposite. They came in on day one, dismantled reflexively all these successful Trump-era policies. In the border, there couldn't be more of a glaring example of that. You've seen literally over 1 million people come here illegally. There is a perverse incentive for these human traffickers to get people across the border because they're just released in the interior United States. You don't know where they're at. So Kamala Harris, needs to do her job. If this is what she's been tasked with doing, she needs to show up and actually have a point of view on this because we know what they were doing wasn't working. We're getting back to the Remain in Mexico policy, and as I said, that's a big win.
So, Eric, you said that they'll put her anywhere. You know what? I think they just want to keep her in the basement, quite frankly, because they don't want her to go anywhere. I mean, she wants to go to Europe, but they're not going to send her to Europe because, goodness gracious, she sticks her foot in her mouth all the time.
Yeah, they need to put a lid on her, right? Like they do Joe Biden about 9 a.m., I suppose.
No kidding. I want to shift gears here to mask mandates. You came out strongly on this, on saying masks for school kids, they inhibit learning and have severe consequences. We're seeing the Biden administration activate the Department of Education to push forward the civil rights investigations into states that are saying no to mask mandates. Why are you taking such a strong position on the mask mandate issue?
Well, I fundamentally don't believe in the forced masking of 5-year-olds all day long in our schools. I think that parents and families ought to be able to make these important decisions. They know what's best. They can be armed with the facts and the science. And it's very, very clear, by the way, there's no widespread study that would show you that masking of school-age kids is effective. In fact, there's a growing body of evidence that shows it can be really detrimental to their health, their learning, whether it's social and emotional or psychological problems. It makes school a much more difficult experience. If you have dyslexia, it makes it much more challenging. So there's a lot of reasons why you wouldn't do it. They've not met their burden on reasons like health reasons are actually science to show that it actually is effective. And so again, this is returning power back to families and back to parents and taking it away from these bureaucrats who, by the way, it's not about science for the left. This is about power, and this is about control, and it's about aggregating and accumulating power. And there was a clip that went viral. We were doing a cold case arrest a couple of weeks ago, and somebody asked me, do you think it's okay for these folks to be using fear for masking? And I said, fear is what's been used by tyrants and dictators throughout the course of human history to aggregate power. And I don't want to live in some futuristic dystopian biomedical security state. And I'm going to do everything I can as Attorney General to fight for people's individual rights. This is a much larger debate about how much control we want to cede to government. And they're going to take and take and take. And I'll make a prediction for you, too. Election time next year, we'll be talking about, we'll be hearing from the left about how it's not safe to have in-person voting, and they'll want to, eviscerate signature verification and in-person voting and having political operatives collect ballots and all these sorts of things we know are, incubators for fraud. But they're never going to let this go. They got a little bit of power. They don't want to let it go. And we have to stand up and fight back. And I'm proud that we're doing it here in Missouri.
So walk me through, Eric, what are you doing to make sure that we push back on the mask mandates? I'm very familiar with what's happening in states like Florida and Texas, and those governors have been getting huge pushback from the school districts themselves. And obviously the propaganda machine is out in basically trying to stop these governors. What are you all doing in Missouri?
Well, what's clear, and you touched on this, if you dare to stand up to this orthodoxy of the left, they want to completely cast you out. And they got alignment from, these public health bureaucrats who've been, discredited, the mainstream media. I mean, they will come after you. That's okay. My job is I don't represent them. I represent the people. And so from the Attorney General's office, we've been as aggressive as anybody in the country in going after jurisdictions that have mask mandates. For example, in St. Louis County, it's the largest county in Missouri, 1 million people. We were successful in court in having that mask mandate struck down. We filed a class action lawsuit against every school district in Missouri last week that has a forced masking policy. Now, the good news is about 90% of the districts don't do it, right? But about 10% of the districts do. And we're taking this legal challenge to them that, number one, you didn't have any evidence to support this and that it's arbitrary and capricious. And if you're going to do it, the people need to be able to weigh in on it. But we're going to press forward. This, to me, is a big fight about returning control back to parents and families and taking it away from these bureaucrats who aren't relying on science or facts, but their never-ending quest to gain more and more control. We have to stand up because it's not going to stop here. It's really not. And they're using this as a constant excuse, again, not based on any studies or science, but their quest for power.
So, my husband completely agrees with you on the fact that they're going to try to keep pushing these mail-in ballots. If he'd be here, he would be going, yes, Eric, you're absolutely right. I do want to, I saw this on Twitter, and it caught my eye. It was actually, this happened in Sydney, Australia. It said, little girl sits in her handcuffed father's lap as he pleads with police after being arrested for not wearing a mask in a park. This is, of course, in Sydney, Australia. We're going to quickly play this, and so I want to get your reaction on this.
You're under arrest because of continuation of the offense.
No,
I asked you to get a
what
mask.
offense I did?
Because you committed the offense.
I told you I'm going to give my daughter to my sister-in-law and I'm going to go run. That's what I told you.
And then you have to leave.
No,
You committed an offense.
I want more clarifications. I want you to make it clearer for me. So I don't do it again. I'll ask you politely, please tell me what I did wrong. I asked you politely, what did I do wrong? And I said please, and you said no.
We have very good friends in Australia. Some of them are partners with us on CPAC Australia. My response to what I saw is the world has gone mad. Eric, this is like the insanity of it all. What are your thoughts when you see things like that happening in countries like Australia, where they also have like these extreme lockdowns as their cases are actually going down? Well,
that's why I mentioned this biomedical security state, right? We have to fight against that. What's happening in Australia is crazy. It's like it's an Orwellian kind of world that they're living in, and we have to push back. I've said this sort of tongue in cheek, but I'm serious. Look, if you've been vaccinated and you want to wear 6 masks on your face and walk around a park by yourself all day long, God bless you. This is America. You can do that. The problem is when government starts telling everybody else to do that. And what you're seeing in Australia is an extreme example of the same kind of agenda we're seeing in the United States, which is it's not about persuasion. It's about government compelling and ridiculous notions that somehow walking outside with your daughter without a mask on is something that you should be arrested for. I mean, again, this is how socialist countries have accumulated power throughout human history. They fearmonger and they use the force of the state to compel people to do things. And we have to push back against. America's been the freest country in the history of the world, and we better maintain that.
Yeah, I think we're seeing these vaccine passports. You've seen these European countries basically stand up against them. You're seeing that implemented in cities like New York and San Francisco. I do want to give you 30 seconds or a minute to, give your reason. You're running for the U.S. Senate. Why?
Well, look, I think you look around and it looks as though as our country and our culture is slipping away. And we need more fighters right now. We need more reinforcements in Washington, D.C. to save America. And that's been my record. I want to take that same fighting spirit as I've had as Attorney General and pushing back on the Biden administration, on these, forced mask mandates, on all the things that we're working on. We need that kind of person. We need that kind of spirit in Washington, D.C., in the United States Senate to save America. And I don't mean that rhetorically. I mean that really. You've got the left right now pushing D.C. statehood, packing the court, federalizing our elections. It's a 50-50 Senate. And we have to make sure we hold on to Missouri with somebody who can win the primary, win the general, and go who's battle tested, who's a proven conservative, who can go fight those important fights. And that's why I'm running for the Senate, and I'm very excited about it.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Attorney General Eric Schmidt.
Great to be with you.
Well, that's all. That's what we have going on today on CPAC Now, America Uncanceled. Remember to tell your friends about the show. It is getting bigger. We're getting more responses from individuals who are saying, keep going, keep fighting, keep doing what we're doing. So we want to thank you all. Good night and God bless.